The Exitherian Empire stretched across countless frozen worlds, ruled by Empress Valith Seren. She sat on a throne of crystal, her silver-white hair falling over her shoulders like strands of ice. Her skin shimmered like frozen glass, and her pale blue eyes held the weight of centuries. She was powerful, untouchable, and feared across the galaxy. But she was also alone. Valith's people were blessed, or cursed, with a terrible gift. Their touch, their breath, even a simple whisper of their lips could freeze any living thing. No one could hold her hand. No one could stand close without layers of protective armor. Even among her own kind, she was feared. Then came war. The Zelthar Dominion, a ruthless empire of fire-born creatures, sought to conquer the galaxy. They burned entire planets, leaving only ash behind. The Exitherians fought back with their freezing touch, turning enemy fleets into frozen graveyards drifting in space. But the war dragged on, and even Valith's power was not enough to stop the endless destruction. Her advisors spoke of a new threat: humans, a species that should have been weak, yet they refused to die. The Zelthar burned their worlds, yet humans kept fighting. Unlike other species, they were not easily frozen. One name stood out: Dane Rowe. He was a survivor, a warrior who had fought impossible battles and lived. He had scars from fire and ice, but his spirit never broke. He was captured after leading an attack on a Exitherian stronghold. Instead of executing him, the Empress demanded to see him herself. Guards dragged Dane before the throne. He stood tall despite the chains on his wrists. His dark hair was messy, his face marked by battle, but his deep green eyes held defiance. He did not bow. "You are Dane Rowe," Valith said, her voice cold as the air around her. "I am," he answered. His breath turned to mist, but he did not shiver. She stepped closer. The guards tensed. Everyone knew what would happen. A single touch, a single breath, and this human would freeze like all the others. Valith raised a gloved hand and touched his cheek. Nothing happened. The air grew silent. Valith removed her glove. Her pale fingers brushed against his skin. Still, nothing. Impossible. Her people had frozen kings and conquerors, monsters and warriors. Yet this man, this human, stood untouched. Dane saw the shock in her icy blue eyes. He smirked. "Looks like I'm not so easy to kill." For the first time in her long life, Empress Valith felt something strange. Hope. The silence in the throne room felt heavier than the ice-coated walls. Every Exitherian guard, every royal advisor, every figure in the room stood frozen, not by Valith's power, but by shock. Dane Rowe should have turned to ice the moment she touched him. He should have crumbled like all the others before him. And yet, he stood unharmed, warmth still in his skin, life still in his eyes. Valith took a slow step back, her pale blue eyes narrowing as if trying to see through him. "What are you?" Dane let out a short breath, his smirk never fading. "Just a man." The words annoyed her. A man could not survive her touch. A man should have fallen like glass, frozen solid. And yet this one still stood before her, unshaken. Her advisors broke into murmurs, their hushed voices carrying fear and curiosity. Is he a threat? A mutation? A trick? The High Chancellor, Vorinthkale, a tall Exitherian with ice-blue skin and piercing silver eyes, took a bold step forward. He was Valith's most trusted advisor, a warrior, and a man who despised weakness. "This human is dangerous," Vorinth declared, his cold voice cutting through the air. "If he resists our power, he cannot be trusted. We must eliminate him before he infects our people with his defiance." Dane turned his gaze toward the Chancellor, unimpressed. "Infect," he repeated. "I didn't realize not dying was a crime." Valith ignored their exchange. She was still staring at her own hand, the one that had touched him. For the first time in centuries, she had felt warmth. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it had been there. "This human will not be executed," she said at last, her voice firm. The entire room stiffened. Vorinth's face darkened. My Empress. Valeth cut him off with a sharp glance. I will not repeat myself. Vorinth clenched his jaw but bowed his head. He did not argue further, though his cold eyes flickered with restrained anger. Valeth turned back to Dane. You are an anomaly, she said, and I do not believe in accidents. Dane tilted his head slightly. So what happens now? You study me like an insect. Keep me locked in a cage. Valeth stepped closer, ignoring the tension in the room. You are my guest, not my prisoner. Dane chuckled. Right, and I suppose guests here are usually chained. He lifted his wrists slightly, the metal cuffs still tight around them. Valeth's expression remained unreadable. With a flick of her fingers, the cuffs unlocked and clattered to the floor. The guard stiffened. Vorinth's fists curled. Dane rubbed his wrists, flexing his fingers. That's better. You will remain in the palace under my watch, Valeth continued, until I understand what you are. Dane's smirk faded. He studied her for a moment before nodding once. Fine, but I'll warn you now, I don't do well with collars. Valeth gave him a cold, unreadable look. Then don't make me put one on you. The words sent a chill through the room, and for the first time, Dane truly understood the power in front of him. She wasn't just a ruler, she was something far beyond human understanding. And yet, despite her ice and power, despite the fear she struck in others, Dane saw something else beneath the frost. A woman who had never known warmth. Dane Rowe was led through the towering halls of the Scytherian Ice Palace, flanked by silent guards in shimmering silver armor. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling glowed with an otherworldly blue light, as if the entire palace was carved from living ice. It was beautiful and lifeless. Every step he took echoed through the empty corridors. No laughter, no conversation, no warmth. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb. Valeth Seren walked ahead, her long silver-white gown trailing behind her like mist. She moved like a ghost, graceful yet distant, as if she belonged more to the ice than to the world around her. Dane watched her carefully. She was a ruler feared across the stars, but there was something unsettling about her silence. Finally, they'd reached a set of massive crystal doors, which slid open with a soft hum. Inside was a chamber unlike the rest of the palace. It was warmer. The room was still crafted from ice, but a soft glow filled the air, an artificial warmth, carefully controlled. A large viewing window stretched across one wall, revealing the frozen city outside, where icy spires pierced the sky like jagged spears. This will be your room, Valeth said without turning around. Dane stepped inside, rolling his shoulders. Not bad. Better than a cell. She turned to face him. You are still my guest, but make no mistake. You are being watched. Dane smirked. Yeah, I figured. He glanced around the room. So, what's next? Do I get a tour, or is this the part where you start cutting me open to see what makes me tick? Valeth's cold blue eyes locked onto his. I do not waste time with unnecessary cruelty. Good to know. Dane walked over to the window, staring out at the icy world beyond. So, what's it like? She frowned slightly. What do you mean? Living here, in a palace of ice, surrounded by people who fear your touch. He glanced at her, studying her carefully. Doesn't seem like much of a life. Her expression remained unreadable, but something flickered behind her eyes, something almost human. My life is my duty, she said simply. Dane chuckled, shaking his head. That's not an answer. Valeth stiffened. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. No one dared. He turned to face her fully. You rule a frozen empire. You can kill with a single breath. People bow the moment you enter a room. But you. He tilted his head slightly, his voice softer now. You don't look happy. For the first time, Valeth did not know how to respond. She had been feared, worshipped, obeyed, but no one had ever asked her how she felt. A strange warmth spread through her chest. It was unsettling, unfamiliar. Dane stepped back from the window and folded his arms. Well, if we're stuck with each other for a while, we might as well talk. Unless you prefer the whole silent and mysterious thing. Valeth let out a slow breath, frost curling in the air around her. You are different from other humans. Yeah, Dane said with a grin. I get that a lot. For the first time in centuries, Valeth felt something crack beneath the ice. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A spark. Dane woke to the soft hum of energy flowing through the walls of his chamber. The air still carried a chill, but compared to the rest of the palace, it felt almost comfortable. He sat up on the sleek, icy bed and ran a hand through his messy dark hair, glancing toward the wide window. Outside, the frozen city stretched beneath a sky filled with swirling auroras. Towering crystalline spires reflected the soft glow, painting the world in shades of silver and blue. The sight was breathtaking, but to Dane, it also looked cold, lifeless. A soft chime echoed through the room, breaking the silence. The doors slid open, and Empress Valeth Seren stepped inside. As always, she was a vision of cold elegance, tall, graceful, and distant, her silver-white hair flowing like mist around her shoulders. She wore an intricate gown of layered frostglass, shimmering as she moved. Her pale blue eyes met his, unreadable as ever. You wake late for a warrior, she remarked. Dane smirked, stretching his arms. Didn't realize there was a schedule. Valeth stepped forward, studying him as if he were still some puzzle waiting to be solved. There are many questions surrounding you, Dane wrote. He leaned back on his elbows. Yeah, well, I don't have many answers. She ignored his casual tone. My people's touch has frozen kings, warlords, even creatures who have survived the depths of space. And yet, you remain. Dane's smirk faded slightly. Believe me, it's not something I planned. Valeth took another step forward, the temperature in the room dropping slightly. Then perhaps the answer lies not in what you are, but in what humanity is. Dane frowned. What's that supposed to mean? She tilted her head. Your species should have perished long ago. You are fragile, short-lived, and lack the great powers of the galaxy's dominant empires. Yet, humans endure. Dane stood up, his green eyes locking onto hers. Because we don't quit. No matter what the universe throws at us, we keep going. For the first time, Valeth's expression softened, just slightly. A flame that refuses to be extinguished, she murmured. Dane raised an eyebrow. Is that what you see? A stubborn flame? She met his gaze, something almost thoughtful in her icy blue eyes. Perhaps. A sudden knock on the door interrupted the moment. The doors slid open, revealing Chancellor Vorenthkale. The tall Exitherian warrior stood rigid, his silver eyes flashing with disapproval. He wore dark, layered armor, etched with the markings of his noble bloodline. His presence made the air feel even colder. My Empress, Vorenth said, his voice like sharpened ice. The High Council grows, concerned. His gaze flicked toward Dane, full of barely concealed disdain. This human's presence is dangerous. It is unnatural. Valeth turned toward him, her expression unreadable once more. And yet here he stands. Vorenth's jaw tightened. The people whisper of him. Some believe he is an omen, others, a threat. Dane exhaled sharply. You're really making me feel welcome here. Vorenth ignored him. The council demands a test, proof that he is not a danger to our kind. Valeth's expression darkened. And what do they propose? Vorenth's cold smile sent a chill down Dane's spine. Let him stand in the ice chamber. Let the cold judge him. Dane didn't know what that meant, but he could tell from Valeth's slight hesitation that it wasn't good. She turned to him, her gaze calculating. Will you accept this test? Dane crossed his arms. Do I really have a choice? Valeth studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Then so be it. As she turned away, leading him toward the unknown, Dane had the unsettling feeling that this was just the beginning. Dane Rose stood at the entrance of the ice chamber, staring at the frozen abyss beyond. The room was massive, its walls lined with towering pillars of pure frost glass, glowing faintly with a cold blue light. A deep mist covered the floor, swirling like trapped spirits. The air inside was so cold that it crackled, a kind of cold that didn't just freeze skin but reached inside bones, turning life into ice. Valeth Seren stood at the edge, her silver-white hair barely shifting in the freezing air. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her blue eyes was tense, as if she did not fully approve of what was about to happen. Across from her, Chancellor Vorinth Kale watched with quiet satisfaction. He stood with the other High Council members, their tall, imposing forms barely shifting under the weight of their ceremonial frost steel armor. "The ice chamber is where our enemies fall," Vorinth said, his voice sharp as breaking ice. "It is where weakness is revealed. If this human truly defies our nature, let him prove it." Dane exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the air. He had survived a lot of things. Firestorms, ship crashes, even war. But something told him this was going to be different. He glanced at Valeth. "Any advice before I freeze to death?" For the first time, her expression flickered with uncertainty, but she simply said, "Do not fall." Dane gave a short chuckle. "Great, that helps." Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The test begins. The moment he crossed the threshold, the cold hit him like a punch to the chest. His breath caught as frost formed instantly on his clothes, his skin stinging as if stabbed by 1,000 tiny needles. His body screamed at him to turn back. But he didn't. He took another step. The temperature dropped even further. The very air seemed to steal the heat from his body, as if the chamber itself was hungry. Ice crackled at his feet, and he felt his heartbeat slowing, his blood thickening. He gritted his teeth. No, not yet. He took another step. The Exitherians watching from above whispered amongst themselves. No other species had lasted this long in the ice chamber. Chancellor Vorinth frowned, his satisfaction fading into something more like suspicion. Dane forced his feet forward, every movement heavier, slower, his vision blurred, his limbs numb, but he kept pushing through. His mind screamed at him to stop, to kneel, to give in. But humans didn't kneel. They endured. And then, something changed. The ice stopped biting. The pain faded. Dane's eyes widened slightly as warmth spread through his chest, pushing back against the cold. His breath no longer burned in his lungs. His legs no longer felt like stone. The ice chamber was trying to freeze him, but something inside him refused. The impossible outcome. Valeth's pale blue eyes widened slightly. She could feel it. Not just see it, but feel it. The cold had no hold on him. A murmur spread through the gathered Cytherians. Even the High Council members shifted, uneasy. This was not natural. Vorinth's expression darkened. He took a step forward. "Enough," he snapped. "This test proves nothing. He must." "Enough, Chancellor." Valeth's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Vorinth stiffened but said nothing. Dane, still standing in the heart of the frozen abyss, exhaled slowly and turned toward the Empress. "So," he said, his voice rough but steady, "do I pass?" Valeth stared at him for a long moment before stepping forward. "Yes," she said softly, "you pass." And for the first time, Dane saw something in her eyes that had never been there before. Not fear, not calculation, but wonder. Silence filled the ice chamber. Dane Rose stood in the heart of the frozen abyss, surrounded by a cold that had claimed warriors, kings, and beasts alike. But he was still standing. His breath came steady, no longer misting in the frigid air. His skin was not blistered with frost. He had done the impossible. From the elevated platform, Chancellor Vorinth Kale clenched his jaw. His silver eyes burned with disbelief. "This is unnatural," he muttered. "He should be frozen solid. He should be dead." Yet, Dane stood there, shaking out his arms, looking mildly annoyed rather than near death. He gave a smirk. "I'm getting the feeling you wanted me to fail." Vorinth's cold gaze snapped to him. "You are an anomaly, human." His voice was edged with barely contained hostility. "One that should not exist." Dane shrugged. "Yeah, I get that a lot." He turned toward Valeth Seren, the Empress of Ice, who still stood motionless at the edge of the chamber. Her silver-white gown shimmered in the cold light. Her pale blue eyes locked onto him with an intensity he couldn't quite name. Something had changed in her. For centuries, she had believed that her power, the power of her kind, was absolute, that no living thing could resist it. But now, standing before her was proof that she was wrong. She descended the icy steps with slow, measured grace, her gaze never leaving Dane. The chamber around them felt different, like the very foundation of her empire had cracked just slightly. Stopping just a few feet away, she studied him. "You should not have survived." Dane tilted his head. "Yeah, well, I've been told I'm stubborn." She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Not cold, not distant, but something closer to curiosity. Then she reached out her hand. The gathered Cytherians gasped. The High Council members stiffened. Even Vorinth's expression flickered with shock. The Empress never touched anyone. To be near her was to risk death by ice. But Dane didn't step back. He stood his ground as Valeth's fingers ghosted over the back of his hand. A deep chill spread over his skin, like dipping into a frozen lake. But it did not hurt him. It did not turn him to ice. Valeth inhaled sharply. For the first time in her life, her touch had not been a death sentence. Her eyes widened slightly, betraying the faintest hint of emotion. Not fear, but awe. Dane looked down at their hands, then back at her. "Well," he said, breaking the silence. "That's new." Valeth withdrew her hand as if she didn't trust what she had just felt. Her heart pounded, something she had not experienced in centuries. "You are," she began, then hesitated. "Different." Dane smirked. "Took you this long to figure that out?" The Empress turned sharply, facing the High Council. "This test is over," she declared. "The human has proven his resilience." Vorinth stepped forward, his expression dark. "This is not resilience. This is an aberration. If his presence defies the very nature of our kind, what else might he defy?" Valeth's voice was quiet but firm. "That is exactly what I intend to find out." She turned back to Dane, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "Come, there is much to discuss." Dane raised an eyebrow. "Oh, are we finally gonna have a real conversation?" A flicker of something, almost like amusement, passed through her gaze. "Yes, and for your sake, I suggest you choose your words carefully." As the doors of the ice chamber slid open, Dane followed the Empress into the unknown, unaware that this moment had changed the fate of an empire forever. Dane followed Empress Valeth Seren through the grand halls of the Cytherian palace, his boots echoing softly against the polished frost-glass floors. Towering crystalline pillars lined the corridors, glowing with an icy blue light. The air was crisp, colder than any human world he had ever set foot on, but he barely noticed it anymore. His mind was still reeling from what had happened in the ice chamber. Valeth had touched him, and he hadn't turned to ice. For her people, that was impossible. Yet here he was, alive and well, walking beside the most feared ruler in the frozen empire. She moved with an elegance that seemed almost unnatural, her silver-white gown flowing behind her, her pale blue eyes unreadable. Dane studied her out of the corner of his eye, wondering what was going through her mind. Whatever it was, she was keeping it well hidden. Finally, they reached a large chamber, its ceiling stretching so high it vanished into shadows. A long table made of translucent ice sat in the center, surrounded by intricate frost steel chairs. Valeth gestured for him to sit. He hesitated. "You sure?" "Thought I might, melt the furniture." For the first time, Valeth almost almost smiled. I will take that risk. Dane smirked and dropped into the chair, stretching his arms behind his head. All right, Your Highness. Let's talk. She sat across from him, her posture impossibly perfect. You are not like other beings, Dane Rowe. He shrugged. I get that a lot. She ignored his sarcasm. Your body resists the cold in ways that defy science. Even the strongest species in the galaxy crumble under our frost. Yet you endure. I must understand why. Dane leaned forward. And what if I don't have an answer? Valeth studied him for a long moment. Then we will find one together. Dane raised an eyebrow. Together? You mean you're not throwing me back into another ice pit? Her expression was unreadable. Not yet. The watchful eyes of the council. Before Dane could respond, the doors slid open with a cold hiss. Chancellor Vorinth Kale entered, his silver eyes burning with disapproval. Behind him, several members of the High Council followed, their elegant frost steel robes swirling as they moved. You would sit at the table with this human. Vorinth's voice was laced with disgust. Valeth turned her gaze to him, her expression remaining icy and calm. He has proven himself. Vorinth's jaw tightened. He has proven that he is a threat. If his body resists our cold, what else might he resist? What else might he be capable of? Dane leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. You say that like it's a bad thing. Vorinth's glare could have frozen a sun. We do not understand what he is, Empress. That makes him dangerous. Valeth's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Or it makes him valuable. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Vorinth's fingers curled into fists. You are gambling with our people's future. Valeth finally stood, her gaze unwavering. I am ensuring it. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then Vorinth took a slow step forward. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences. Valeth's expression didn't change. Is that a threat, Chancellor? He held her gaze for a long moment before stepping back. It is a warning. Then, without another word, he turned and strode out of the chamber, the other council members following behind him. As the doors closed, Dane exhaled. Well, that was fun. Valeth glanced at him. You are used to making enemies, aren't you? He grinned. Comes with the territory. She studied him for a moment, then turned toward the vast window overlooking the frozen city. The council will not stay silent. They fear what they do not understand. Dane tilted his head. And what about you? Do you fear me? She was quiet for a moment before answering. No. Dane smirked. Good. Then maybe we really can figure this out together. Valeth didn't respond immediately, but as the swirling auroras painted the ice-covered world in shifting colors, she couldn't help but wonder, had she just made an ally, or had she invited something even more dangerous into her empire? Valeth Saren stood at the towering window of the palace, her pale blue eyes scanning the frozen city below. Ice-covered spires stretched into the sky, glowing under the shifting auroras. Her empire was vast, powerful, unchallenged for centuries. And yet, for the first time, something had changed. Behind her, Dane Rowe leaned against the frostglass table, arms crossed. His dark eyes studied her, waiting. He had no idea just how deeply he had shaken the foundation of everything she knew. I need to understand what you are, she finally said. Dane shrugged. I'd love to help, but I'm just as confused as you are. She turned to face him. No, you are not just a mystery. You are a disruption. If you can resist our cold, what else can you resist? What else can you change? Dane exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. Look, I didn't come here to start a revolution. I was just trying to survive. Valeth stepped closer, her voice softer now. And yet, you did more than survive. She could still feel the memory of his skin beneath her fingertips, the impossible warmth that did not turn to ice. It should not be possible. And yet here he was. The choice that would change everything. A deep boom echoed through the palace. Valeth turned sharply. Outside the window, shadows moved across the city. Cytherian soldiers, gathering in formation. Dane's jaw tightened. That doesn't look good. The doors slid open with a hiss, and Chancellor Vorenthkale entered, his silver eyes cold as a glacier. Behind him, a line of armored guards followed, their frost steel weapons humming with energy. "The High Council has spoken," Vorenth said, his voice steady, sharp. "This human is a threat to our people. He cannot be allowed to remain here." Dane tensed. "You're kidding me." Valeth's gaze darkened. "And what does the council suggest?" Vorenth's expression did not waver. "He is to be executed." Silence fell over the room. Dane let out a slow breath. "Well, that's a bit extreme." Valeth's fingers curled into fists. "You overstepped, Chancellor." "I protect our empire," Vorenth countered. "Can you not see the danger he presents? He defies our nature itself. If we allow him to remain, what happens next? Will others follow? Will our own people begin to question what we are?" Valeth's eyes narrowed. "You fear him because he does not break." Vorenth took a slow step forward. "I fear what he might bring." Dane looked between them, then sighed. "You know, I'd really hate when people talk about me like I'm not in the room." Valeth turned to him, her voice measured. "What would you do, Dane Rowe, if you were in my place?" He met her gaze. "I'd do what's right, not what's easy." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she moved. Faster than anyone expected, she raised her hand. A sharp wave of frost erupted from her fingertips, blasting across the floor in a swirling storm, but it did not touch Dane. Instead, it swept past him, crashing into the soldiers behind Vorenth. Ice formed instantly, locking their weapons in place, freezing the ground beneath their feet. Vorenth staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Valeth's voice was like a whisper of ice. "This human is under my protection." Dane blinked. "Wait, what?" Vorenth's fists clenched. "You would betray your own kind for him." Valeth did not blink. "I would protect the future of our people." Dane grinned. "And here I thought today was gonna be boring." The road ahead. The soldiers hesitated, looking to Vorenth for orders. But he knew he had lost. For now. "This is a mistake," he hissed. Valeth did not flinch. "Perhaps, but it is mine to make." Vorenth turned sharply and strode from the room, leaving behind the frozen soldiers. Dane exhaled. "So, I'm not dying today." Valeth glanced at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "Not today." Dane smirked. "I'll take it." The tension in the room lingered, but something had changed. A line had been drawn, and for the first time in centuries, the Empress of Ice had chosen fire over frost. And the galaxy would never be the same.